The portrait had hung in the hallway for nearly a century, its surface dulled by dust and time, its figures softened into something almost gentle. A mother seated at the center, her gloved hands folded in her lap. A father standing behind her, posture stiff, eyes steady. 3 children arranged carefully at their feet, dressed in Sunday best, faces frozen in the solemn patience demanded by early cameras. For decades, visitors passed it without comment. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Nothing invited a second look. It wasn't until the restoration began that the silence around the image started to feel deliberate. As layers of grime were lifted away, details emerged with unsettling clarity. The fabric of the mother's dress revealed faint creases that suggested movement, as if she had been turning just before the shutter closed. The father's shadow, once a vague blur, sharpened into something too long for the angle of the light. And the children, there was a tension in their expressions now, a barely perceptible strain around their eyes, as though they were concentrating on not looking at something just outside the frame. The restorer paused when the background came into focus. What had once appeared to be an ordinary wall now showed subtle distortions, lines bending where they should not, shapes layered beneath the paint like memories trapped under skin. The longer one stared, the harder it became to tell which elements belonged to the room and which did not. The space behind the family felt crowded, though nothing obvious occupied it. Then the faces began to change, not dramatically, not enough to alarm at first. A tightening of the mother's mouth. A faint imbalance in the father's gaze, as if one eye was focused on something far closer than the other. And the children's hands, resting so calmly in the original image, now seemed positioned with intention, fingers curled in ways that suggested signaling rather than stillness. By the time the restoration was complete, the portrait no longer felt like a record of a family posed in 1930. It felt like a moment interrupted. A warning preserved in silver and shadow. And once you noticed what was wrong, it became impossible to believe that no one had seen it before. Key point number 1 centers on the moment the restoration process begins and quietly transforms the portrait from a harmless family artifact into something deeply unsettling. For decades, the photograph survived as a familiar object, overlooked precisely because of its ordinariness. It hangs on walls, appears in albums, and is absorbed into the background of family history. Time blurs its details, softening edges and disguising inconsistencies. This long period of neglect is essential, because it allows the wrongness in the image to remain hidden in plain sight, normalized by age and repetition. The key point lies in the idea that nothing supernatural announces itself at first, instead, the threat exists dormant, waiting for clarity. When the restorer begins cleaning the image, the act itself feels neutral, even respectful. The goal is preservation, not revelation. Yet each careful removal of dust and discoloration functions like peeling back layers of memory that were never meant to resurface. What was once perceived as damage or photographic imperfection starts to resolve into deliberate detail. Shadows become too defined. Lines sharpen where they should blur. The composition, previously dismissed as a product of old equipment, reveals intentional framing choices that feel subtly manipulative. The restorer does not encounter a sudden shock but a growing discomfort, the kind that creeps in slowly and resists rational explanation. This turning point establishes unease through realism. The tools are ordinary, the setting professional, the intentions pure. Nothing mystical occurs, yet the atmosphere changes. The image begins to feel less like a record and more like a constructed moment, staged with care beyond what was necessary for a family portrait. The restorer notices that the figures seem arranged not for aesthetics but for containment, as though the photograph were designed to hold something in place rather than capture a memory. This realization reframes the entire image, shifting it from sentimental object to silent participant in something unresolved. Crucially, this point introduces the theme of visibility and denial. The wrongness was always there, embedded within the photograph from the moment it was taken. It required clarity to be seen, and clarity itself becomes the danger. The act of restoration symbolizes humanity's impulse to uncover truth, even when that truth resists being known. By beginning the story with a subtle, methodical uncovering rather than immediate horror, the narrative builds trust in realism while laying the foundation for dread, suggesting that the most disturbing discoveries are not created by interference but revealed by attention. Key point number 2 focuses on the gradual realization that the family's expressions and body language do not align with the context of a formal portrait, introducing the idea that the subjects are responding to something unseen rather than the camera itself. As the restored image becomes clearer, the restorer begins to notice inconsistencies that feel psychological rather than technical. The faces, once dismissed as stiff due to long exposure times, now carry a shared tension that feels too coordinated to be accidental. Each expression differs slightly, yet they all reflect the same restrained anxiety, as though the family has been instructed to remain calm in the presence of something that makes calm impossible. The children become the most unsettling element. Their eyes, once blurred by age, now appear sharply focused but not on the lens. Their gazes drift subtly to one side, unified in direction yet varied in intensity. One child seems to be watching with cautious curiosity, another with fear barely suppressed, the third with an unsettling acceptance. This range of reaction suggests familiarity rather than surprise, implying that whatever holds their attention has been present long enough to become known to them. The hands of the children reinforce this impression. Fingers curl inward unnaturally, palms angled as if bracing or signaling, gestures too deliberate to be the result of stiffness alone. The adults offer a different kind of disturbance. The mother's posture, upright and composed at first glance, reveals strain when examined closely. Her shoulders sit just slightly too high, her jaw tightened in a way that suggests effort rather than elegance. Her expression reads not as maternal calm but as practiced restraint, the look of someone attempting to maintain normalcy under quiet pressure. The father's stance carries authority, yet his eyes betray division. One eye aligns with the camera, fulfilling his role in the portrait, while the other appears drawn elsewhere, focused inward or behind the viewer, creating the impression that he is monitoring something rather than posing. This turning point deepens the horror by shifting it from the environment to the people themselves. The family is no longer simply part of the scene, they are participants in an unspoken moment of endurance. Their collective tension implies instruction, warning, or containment. The photograph becomes evidence not of who they were, but of what they were enduring together. The more the restorer studies the image, the clearer it becomes that the family is united not by blood or tradition, but by shared attention to something that could not be captured directly, something just outside the frame, exerting enough presence to shape every face and gesture within it. Key point number 3 introduces the discovery that the background of the portrait is not a neutral setting but an active, distorted space that contradicts the physical reality it is supposed to represent. As restoration sharpens the depth and contrast of the image, the wall behind the family begins to reveal subtle irregularities. What once appeared to be a plain interior backdrop now shows faint bends in its vertical lines, as though the structure itself is warping inward. The perspective does not obey the rules of the room it claims to depict, creating the impression that the space is compressing rather than receding, drawing attention toward a point that cannot be fully resolved. Closer examination reveals layered shapes beneath the surface texture of the wall, forms that seem partially erased yet stubbornly present. These shapes do not resemble cracks, stains, or decorative patterns typical of aging photographs. Instead, they suggest outlines that were either painted over or deliberately obscured before the photograph was taken. Their arrangement feels purposeful, forming a loose symmetry that mirrors the positioning of the family in the foreground. The effect is subtle enough to evade immediate recognition, yet persistent enough to unsettle anyone who looks too long, as if the image is resisting interpretation while demanding it at the same time. The longer the restorer studies the background, the more it begins to feel crowded despite its apparent emptiness. There is a sense of depth where none should exist, a suggestion that the space behind the family extends farther than the room allows. Shadows overlap in impossible ways, intersecting at angles that do not correspond to any visible light source. This inconsistency implies the presence of something that alters the environment simply by existing within it, something that bends perception without ever appearing directly. This turning point reframes the photograph as a boundary rather than a record. The background is no longer passive, it becomes the container for whatever the family is responding to. The distortion suggests confinement, as though the room has been reshaped to accommodate something that does not belong within ordinary dimensions. The photograph itself begins to feel less like an image and more like a seal, holding the warped space in a fixed state. Emotionally, this discovery shifts the restorer's fear from curiosity to recognition. The unease is no longer abstract or psychological but spatial and physical. The image implies that something was present at the moment of capture that could not be allowed to escape the frame. The background's refusal to remain inert suggests that the photograph is performing an ongoing function, preserving not just the likeness of a family but the conditions necessary to keep something contained, suspended in a moment that must never be allowed to move forward. Key point number 4 revolves around the realization that the photograph does not merely capture a moment but actively alters itself in response to attention, suggesting a living relationship between the image and those who study it. After the major elements have been restored, the restorer begins to notice changes that cannot be attributed to technique or lighting. Details appear inconsistent between viewings. A shadow seems slightly repositioned. The tension in a hand appears more pronounced than before. These shifts are minor enough to invite doubt, yet frequent enough to erode confidence in memory. The photograph begins to feel unstable, as though it resents being fully seen. This instability introduces the idea that observation itself is a catalyst. The longer the restorer studies the image, the more responsive it seems to become. The family's expressions appear subtly altered, not in a dramatic or supernatural way, but in the manner of people adjusting themselves under scrutiny. A child's gaze seems to lift just enough to meet the viewer's eyes. The mother's lips appear pressed tighter than before, as if bracing. These changes create the impression that the figures are aware of being watched and are reacting defensively rather than passively existing within the frame. The background distortions intensify in tandem with this awareness. The warped lines behind the family seem to deepen, the layered shapes growing marginally clearer, as though attention is feeding their definition. This establishes a dangerous feedback loop. To look is to clarify, and to clarify is to strengthen whatever the photograph is restraining. The act of study becomes indistinguishable from participation, implicating the observer in the image's ongoing tension. This turning point shifts the story's threat from historical mystery to present danger. The photograph is no longer confined to its origin in 1930, it is interacting with the present, responding to modern eyes just as it once responded to the unseen presence during its creation. The restorer begins to feel watched in return, not by the figures themselves but by the space they are containing. The image no longer feels finished, even in its restored state. It feels active, alert, and increasingly strained. Psychologically, this moment introduces paranoia grounded in evidence rather than imagination. The restorer documents changes, compares photographs, seeks reassurance in logic, yet the inconsistencies persist. The inability to fix the image in a single, stable state suggests that it was never meant to be stable. Its purpose is endurance, not preservation. The family's collective restraint now reads as ongoing effort rather than historical posture, implying that whatever they are holding back has not diminished with time, only waited for someone to look closely enough to begin loosening the tension. Key point number 5 brings the revelation that the photograph's true function is not containment alone, but substitution, implying that the family in the image is not merely holding something back, but slowly being replaced by it. As the restorer continues to observe the subtle shifts within the portrait, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. The changes are no longer random or defensive. They appear directional. The distortions in the background seem to move forward, while the clarity of the family begins to erode in specific, deliberate ways. Details that once sharpened with restoration now soften again, not uniformly, but selectively, as though something is reclaiming space within the image. The children are the first to show signs of this transition. Their features lose definition around the edges, expressions blurring into something less human and more suggestive, as if their individuality is being overwritten. Their eyes, once fixed on something outside the frame, now appear hollowed, reflecting depth without focus. It feels as though they are no longer looking at anything, but serving as openings through which something else is learning how to look. This change reframes their earlier acceptance not as familiarity, but as surrender. The adults follow more slowly. The mother's composed restraint begins to resemble exhaustion. Her posture slackens between viewings, the tension that once held her upright seeming to fail incrementally. The father's divided gaze resolves into something more disturbing. Both eyes now appear aligned, but not with the camera. They face forward with an intent that feels newly unified, suggesting that whatever once demanded his attention has moved closer, no longer requiring monitoring, only accommodation. The background distortions now mirror the figures themselves. Shapes beneath the wall's surface echo the outlines of the family, imperfect reflections that grow clearer as the family fades. This visual correspondence suggests exchange rather than invasion. The photograph is not breaking down. It is completing a process set in motion the moment the shutter closed in 1930. The family posed not to record their existence, but to preserve a boundary long enough for a transfer to occur across time. This final turning point transforms the horror into inevitability. The photograph is revealed as a mechanism designed to endure until it is seen clearly enough to finish its work. The restorer's attention has not awakened something new but has fulfilled the conditions required for replacement. The family's role was never to survive within the frame, but to be gradually erased so that what they contained could learn shape, posture, and presence, preparing to occupy the space of the observer once the image no longer needs them.